All right. Okay. Audio seems to work. Let's slowly get started here. Since we only have 15 minutes, thanks for taking your lunchtime to come here, by the way. So this is my opportunity to kind of warm up to my Spring Framework 5 2 talk right afterwards. This is a 15 years of Spring retrospective. 15 years of Spring in 15 minutes with 15 slides. The 15 years are actually quite creatively counted. I started from my own involvement in early 2003, counting up until 2018. We're really already in the 16th or 17th year of Spring, depending on where you start counting. So let's start with my own involvement. I read that book back in 2002. December 2002, I got myself this like almost 700-page book, read it over Christmas break. Rod Johnson wrote this book, spent time writing this book for the better part of a year, the better part of the year 2002. And not only wrote the text, he also wrote a kind of a supporting framework code that was illustrated in the book, explained in the book, and in many ways, the design was laid out in the book. It followed design discussions, design ideas in the book. That download was a download on the publisher's website in a com.interface21 package. Didn't really have a name, didn't really have much of a goal of a future, an immediate future. It was just a download for a book. So I really liked what I read in that book, and got in touch with Rod through the author feedback forum on the publisher's website, and suggested, like, what about taking these ideas, the code, the quite extensive code that came with the book, this kind of prototype, this early form of a framework, and to turn it into a proper open source project. Not like a download that comes with a book that some people are going to look at and move on, but rather an open source framework that keeps evolving, that keeps building a community where we keep taking those design ideas forward. And that's exactly what we did. Towards early 2003, we created a SourceForge project. We had to choose a name. SourceForge was the GitHub of the times, right? And the SourceForge project needs a name, so the first phase we had to go through is selecting a name. And we came up with Spring Framework after a couple of suggestions, but we really liked the implications of Spring the season, and Spring Framework, of course, as a unique name. On SourceForge, Spring Framework was the name that we went with, created the repository. We uploaded the code that came with the book as a starting point, and had a very intense first phase of development in that first half of 2003. Leading up to the first release, Spring Framework 0.9, in June 2003. So on our way there, of course, before we would even agree that we follow that path, Rod came up to me and said, like, you know what, this is a really great idea, this turning it into an open source project, but I need equal commitment. He couldn't do it on his own. So in that phase, I was already strongly involved as the technical lead for the core framework project, as kind of a shared lead initially. As of the Spring Framework 0.9 release in June 2003, I was officially the release manager, kind of the core framework project lead in the sense of me laying out the roadmap, managing the releases, down to every maintenance release. And I keep serving as the project lead and as the release manager ever since. So every single Spring Framework release in the past 15 or 16 years was literally signed off by myself, even all the maintenance and backport releases. As you may imagine, I'm a bit of a control freak in that respect, but I really believe in sound project management and release management. So back to the framework itself. The origins, of course, the original incarnations of Spring predate JDK 5, predate annotations. So the internal architecture was a programmatic architecture with an XML bin definition reader on top, an XML configuration format as the reference model on top, and some early support for other metadata formats following very soon. At transactional, our first annotation-driven service annotation came in Spring Framework 1.2, shortly after JDK 5 got released. So we quite ambitiously evolved that framework, but not on its own. There was already an open source ecosystem in the Java space. Not only with the ones here, but of course those are names that are still very present today. Tomcat was already a thing at the time. It turned into a real self-sustained project that you would be willing to use as your primary Java-based web server. There was of course Jetty with a history just as long. There was Hibernate, and Spring's Hibernate integration was quite famous at the time. Spring Hibernate combination still is very popular today, of course. There are also projects that faded out. The above-mentioned Struts era. Apache Struts had its time. Of course, it had a few years where it was the primary choice of web framework. It largely faded out in the meantime, of course, but there was also a prominent stack at the time that was Struts, Spring, and Hibernate running on Tomcat as a very popular stack combination of those days. We kept writing books. There was a follow-up book to the initial J2E design development one called J2EE without EGB that I was a co-author of. This is already the third book in our history. The first dedicated Spring Framework book, dating back to 2005, a long time ago. And those are all original images, by the way, that you're seeing in this presentation, reflecting those times. So in particular, this one is really reflecting the five of us writing this book in younger incarnations of ourselves. Suffice to say that writing this book was really in conflict with engineering work on the framework itself. And this was the last book project that, as far as I'm aware, any of us were involved in as primary authors. We only did reviews and forewords afterwards, with other people stepping up and writing books about Spring and Spring-related topics. This was really the last book we did ourselves, and we focused on evolving the framework. Because there was really a small team, a company formed around it called Interface 21 at the time, a few people really working on the open source projects, most people doing trainings, most people doing consulting and trying to turn this into a sustainable model. Spring Framework 2.0 was a very collaborative effort with lots of input from everyone in the team and also from community contributions already. It was still very much XML-based, but with the namespace format, the configuration namespaces, the AOP namespace, the TX namespace, which also, in terms of its model, suggested the @enable annotations that came later. Spring Framework 2.5 in 2007 started introducing annotation-driven dependency injection in Anger, so the @AutoWide model, qualifiers, component scanning. Spring MVC with @controls and @request mappings really date back to Spring Framework 2.5, released in late 2007. So there was some really, really aggressive evolution of the framework. The framework's core architecture, the core structure and the core architecture largely remained the same. We strongly believe in evolution, not in revolution with backwards compatibility breakages. And Spring Framework 2.0, 2.5 really demonstrated this quite well with XML next to the annotation-based configuration format within the same framework architecture. We turned into SpringSource in the meantime. So there were the former company Interface 21, which was largely a services company, morphed into SpringSource. SpringSource significantly larger, more people working there, and our understanding was more of a product company at the time, where we really tried to do not only the Spring open source portfolio, but also several products around it. IDE tooling, and two server products called TC Server and DM Server. DM Server, an OSGI-based runtime that was contributed to the Eclipse project later on and has an afterlife as Eclipse Virgo now. But that just as a side note. At the time, it was still a SpringSource product. And of course, as a US-based product company, you have to have corporate marketing, coming up with large-scale marketing campaigns. And this was one of them that I have fond, strange memories of. This was one of the US-led campaigns, Weapons for the War on Java Complexity. If I wouldn't have told you that it came out of the US, I guess it's obvious, right? So there are Spring battleships here and TC server tanks, TC server being our Tomcat distribution, DM server, the OSGI-based product, DM server fighter planes, all attacking kind of this land of complexitania. From a European perspective, once we saw this campaign for the first time, we tried to do everything we can to not use it in Europe. But I mean, that's what you get. Marketing is an important part overall. No, you can't get everything right. I count this as a mistake in retrospect, but it's kind of interesting how we went about it. We are mostly a developer marketing company, but at that time we started having corporate marketing. Back to the open source ecosystem. This was really an ecosystem in the meantime. We not only had the core Spring Framework project, there were already several popular projects around us. Spring Integration, Spring Batch, then more specifically purposed ones, Spring Roo, a sort of early version of the ideas that later turned into Boot, some ideas at least. There's Grails as kind of a Groovy-based web framework on top of core Spring, and specific frameworks like Spring Security, Spring Webflow, very popular at the time, Spring Data emerging at those times. Most of those, or all of the here mentioned ones, were already present 10 years ago in 2009. And this is, by the way, also an original graphic that we used at that time. So 2009, of course, saw the launch of Spring Framework 3.0 in late 2009. This is already a couple of months post-acquisition. SpringSource got acquired by VMware in late 2009. And formally, Spring Framework 3.0 is the first Spring Framework release with SpringSource being a division at VMware. But it was in the making for a long, long time. We worked on Spring Framework 3.0 for more than 2 years. It came with a JDK 5 baseline, complete revision of the code base, all APIs. Java EE 6 support at the time, which was quite timely, just Java EE 6 went out just a little bit before. Framework-wise, it introduced the notion of configuration classes. Previously, a prototype, kind of a non-supported extension that we called Java config before, became part of the core framework offering at that time. Of course, that's the foundation for what is now known as Spring Boot. Spring Boot is really configuration classes on steroids. The core facilities were introduced 10 years ago in Spring Framework 3.0. And Spring MVC saw a major overhaul. It already had the annotation-based model, as I mentioned before, since 2.5, but it now came with a complete revision, REST support, path variable abstraction, validation integration, many other things that we take for granted right now date back to that time. So just to give you a few visual impressions, this is basically the reference model in 2009. Component classes like service classes, annotated with certain stereotypes, certain characteristics, dependency injection at the constructor level here through an annotation, and transactional service declarations for methods that require a transactional boundary. Pretty much the same model that we still use today, in a refined form, of course. So the next major release at our, also a few years into it at VMware, corporation-wise, was Spring Framework 4.0. And Spring Framework 4.0 was a quite ambitious effort on our end. With full JDK 8 support, several months before JDK 8 went GA, we really tried to be ahead of the times because we saw so much potential in what became JDK 8. And of course, JDK 8 is now the baseline for everything we're doing, even now in 2019. So the Spring Framework 4.0 was also the foundation for the Spring Boot 1 generation. So Spring Boot, not the focus of this particular presentation, but Spring Boot emerged shortly after Spring Framework 4.0, and of course developed a whole community of its own almost. It's now the preferred entry point into the Spring ecosystem for many people. It builds on core facilities in Spring Framework 4.0, the configuration model, many refinements like configuration conditions that came in to the core framework in Spring Framework 4. The typical controller, this is Spring Framework 4.3 in the meantime, started looking like this. It's a refinement of the old controller model. We had now these pre-composed annotations, more specifically purpose mapping annotations. We had course support. We had, of course, path variable extraction, as already mentioned. So it's largely the same kind of model with the same visual impression and the same development experience, but with refined features all the way through. That is the state of the art as we see it here in Spring Framework 4.3, and it still is the state-of-the-art in Spring Framework 5 if you choose to use the Spring MVC stack. So, Spring Framework 5, of course, taking us almost to the present, launched about 2 years ago, again with a huge baseline revision. So it's like JDK 5 in Spring Framework 3, which was a really major revision, giving us generics, var arcs, and JDK 8 really gave us lambdas, it gave us method references, it gave us the Java util function package and Java util collection streams. So lots of facilities that are really great tools for framework authors and in particular for framework API designers. So we took the opportunity with Spring Framework 5 to again revisit the entire code base, upgrade the entire framework to the JDK 8 API level, also the framework surface area. If you're interacting with the framework through APIs, through callbacks, through implementing interfaces that now have default methods in Java 8, you'll have a really fully Java 8 oriented experience. Ironically, that turned out to be not that big a deal for most people because we've been told that the Java 8 experience, the development experience using Java 8 with Spring Framework 4.3 was already so totally fine in practice that this full baseline upgrade that we did in Spring Framework 5 didn't make as much difference. We had so much optional support for Java 8, automatically activated optional support for Java 8 before, that probably we were more excited about this particular baseline upgrade in Spring Framework 5 than anyone else. But still, there's a little subtle extra value that even came in Spring Framework 5 here, beyond the optional Java 8 support that was there before. Of course, there's also Servlet 4 and generally the Java E8 API level. More importantly, there's strong design themes that we chose to apply to the Spring Framework 5 generation. Functional API design, as in Java 8's functional API design, as in Java 8 collection streams, as in Java util function, also as in Kotlin functions. We started embracing Kotlin in Spring Framework 5, which of course keeps being a huge theme going forward. At the same time, we started tackling reactive architectures. So two really very, very major design themes starting to emerge here in Spring Framework 5. And just to give you a reference, this is the foundation for the Spring Boot 2 generation that we're on right now. So an important decision in evolving the framework here was how do we go about reactive architectures? Do we try to kind of unify the web framework so that it is at the same time a servlet-based framework and can be used reactively? We didn't really pursue that path. We learned pretty quickly on our way to Spring Framework 5 that the only way to do this properly is to have a dedicated reactive web stack. So in Spring Framework 5, you actually get two web stacks. You get Spring MVC, Servlet MVC, running on the Servlet stack as usual, without any breakages, the same APIs, the same SPIs, the same model, the same behavioral characteristics. And in parallel to that, you get what we call Spring WebFlux, which is our reactive web offering. In many ways, we could have done a different product. We could have called it differently, not Spring, something else, whatever. Well, at least we could have shipped it as a separate project. But we chose to include it in Spring Framework proper because we saw so much demand for other projects building on it. Spring Security integrating with it, Spring Data integrating with it. For this to become a core part of our offering going forward, we chose to include it in Spring Framework proper. That's where it still lives today. And to wrap this up, we are now on our path to Spring Framework 5.2. Spring Framework 5.2 is about to be released. We are aiming for an RC1 in July. GA is currently aiming for early September. Spring Framework 5.2 is largely a continuation of the themes that we laid out, that we started laying out for Spring Framework 5.0. So it continues our Java 8 API efforts. It's surprising how much impact Java 8 has on library design, on framework API design. It keeps having an impact. Even now, there are further refinements that we're making, not just in terms of the obvious stuff, not just the language features, it's mostly API integration, where, for example, Java.time integration, there's always potential for improving there. So we're not at the end of that road yet. A strong focus is on our annotation processing logic. Spring Framework 5.2 is significantly more efficient, quite radically more efficient in its annotation processing compared to previous Spring Framework versions. So it is significantly faster on startup with a large number of annotated components. And a number of side benefits, integration, optional integration with indexes, etc. So it's really a total overhaul, a re-implementation of annotation processing, largely transparent to you. If you're building applications, there's nothing to do. You get those benefits just through an upgrade to Spring Framework 5.2, continuing that tradition of ours. And there's a couple of important topics that kind of complete the picture for us. Spring Framework 5.0 was the start of a generation. We knew that it was sort of incomplete. There was no reactive transaction abstraction in 5.0. There is now in 5.2. And we ship reactive transaction managers for MongoDB and for R2DBC, for our reactive relational database effort run by Pivotal. We ship those in Spring Data, integrating with the core framework facilities in 5.2. Similarly minded, we didn't really have a fully reactive messaging architecture before in our Spring messaging module. So in Spring Framework 5.2, there is now a reactive flavor of Spring messaging, a little bit similar to Spring WebFlux in style and in mind, primarily driven by RSocket integration. So it is a general reactive messaging abstraction, but its strongest driver is RSocket. So we're really embracing a new communication model, which is externally run. We are strongly involved in RSocket, but it's externally run. Of course, it's a collaboration with many other key players out there. And talking about collaborations, we have a strong ongoing relationship with JetBrains. We always believed in, all across those 15 years, we believed in close collaboration with other major stakeholders in this industry, other open source projects, but also IDE and tooling vendors, server vendors. And JetBrains with Kotlin is a primary example today. In Spring Framework 5.2, we upgrade our Kotlin efforts quite a bit. There's now early support for Kotlin coroutines. So to use the Kotlin coroutine model adapted to our underlying reactive architectures. This is quite straightforward, not least of it all because of the active collaboration that we have. We chose to include those forward-looking efforts in Spring Framework 5.2 already, even if they are kind of just about ready towards September for general availability. We hope that you can have an interesting experience kind of getting the feeling for how you could work with Kotlin coroutines in Spring quite early on, even against the current milestone and the upcoming RC1 already. By all means, please follow our evolution. Try Spring Framework 5.2, and I hope you enjoyed this quick tour through a little bit of history and a little bit of our current work. Thanks for your attention.